Steady now, bring up the mud.
Down gently, align it with the
Pull it up.
fresh spices straight from the...
Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we travel to an oasis at the edge of the desert, where a steady spring feeds a low mound built by many generations. This place is Jericho. People often call it the first city on Earth. But what makes a city in the first place? Is it walls and towers, stored grain, craft and trade, or a community that stays and rebuilds in the same spot over and over? We will follow the story from hunters camping by the water to the first farmers shaping mud brick houses around courtyards. We will look at the great stone tower and the early walls, the layers of rebuilding, the rituals that honored the dead, and the trade routes that carried obsidian, salt, and ideas. Then we will trace Jericho into later ages, when kings and merchants left their marks and legend met archaeology. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let the past come into focus. This is a story thousands of years old, and tonight, it is yours. Let's begin. Stand on the floor of the Jordan Rift at the place later called es-Sultan, and you feel geography doing work that no king or general could ever match. The ground lies about 260 meters below sea level. The air is warm and still. To the west, the Judean highlands rise like a stone wall. To the east, the Jordan River slides toward the Dead Sea. In the middle of this dry amphitheater, a freshwater spring pours out of the limestone and refuses to stop. If you had to pick a single point in the Levant where mobile people might first try staying put, this would be it. At the end of the last glacial period, the climate shifted from cold and unstable to something kinder. Wild cereals spread across the valley margins. Gazelle herds browsed the steppe. By about 12,000 years ago, groups we call Natufian foragers were already lingering near rich patches of food for much longer than a single season. They left flint blades with a glossy sheen that comes from harvesting grasses. They left heavy mortars and pestles for pounding seeds. They left the first hints that the yearly circuit of movement was giving way to something more rooted. The oasis at Jericho drew them as a predictable pantry and a good place to sleep. The spring at Jericho was more than a water source. It was a stabilizer. A reliable flow meant that dry years did not force people to leave. It meant gardens could be scratched out of the floodplain. It meant reeds for matting and thatch were always close at hand. When families decided to try staying through the year, they built accordingly. The earlier structures were round or oval, often partly dug into the earth, with low stone footings and walls of mud brick or packed clay. Roofs were likely reed and timber, pitched to shed the rare but heavy rains. Inside, a central hearth darkened the ceiling. Along the edges were bins and shallow pits for storage. Floors were sometimes coated with a smooth white plaster made by heating limestone until it broke into quicklime, then slaking it with water and spreading it like wet chalk. That recipe requires fire hot enough to alter rock and the nerve to try it. It tells us curiosity was already a survival skill. Daily life left a dense scatter of clues. Grinding stones worn into gentle basins show that seeds were ground into flour. Sickle blades with bright polish show that people cut stands of barley and wheat. Charred plant remains include wild barley and wild wheats, whose grains are small by later standards. Some scholars argue that early inhabitants of Jericho were already coaxing these grasses to grow thicker around their houses by clearing competing plants and watering. Others argue that full domestication came later. The truth is probably messy and local. People here were experimenting. They gathered, they planted, they watched which patches responded. Over a few centuries, those experiments changed both the plants and the people. Animals helped bridge the gap between hunting and herding. Gazelle bones are common in early Jericho deposits, a reminder that meat still came from the chase. In the wider region, dogs were beginning to live beside people rather than apart from them. Even if we cannot name a Jericho dog yet, the partnership was spreading. Taming companions that could help find game or warn of danger made fixed houses safer. It also made sleeping in the same place night after night feel less risky. Burials bring us closest to their ideas about family and place. In many early houses, the dead were laid to rest under packed floors. The living slept over remembered ancestors. This practice ties a household to its ground with bonds stronger than any wall. It also reveals the slow birth of communal memory. Centuries later, in the same mound, plastered human skulls with shell inlays would stare back at excavators from beneath floors and benches. Those famous faces belong to a slightly later phase, but the habit of treating houses as family vaults began in the earliest levels. To live at Jericho was to live with your past. The site itself grew in the way only long-lived villages do, as a mound of layered homes and swept courtyards. When a building slumped, people leveled the top and built again. When floods from winter storms cut gullies, people filled them and repaired. The mound rose slowly, a meter here, a meter there. Each lift recording a generation's worth of cooking, smoke, and repairs. Archaeologists read that stacked archive with tools that would bewilder those first villagers. Charcoal and seeds go to radiocarbon labs. Microscopic slices of packed floor reveal ash lenses and plaster recipes. Stone chips and bone fragments map the corners where working and eating happened. The tidy maps and graphs that result are simply modern ways of seeing the daily routine of a few hundred people who took the gamble of staying. Trade ties show that even a rooted community was not isolated. Among the beads and trinkets at Jericho are shells from the Mediterranean coast and perhaps the Red Sea. Some blades in the region were made of obsidian, a volcanic glass that had to travel many days from Anatolian sources. Bitumen from the Dead Sea Basin could be pressed into sicklebacks as an adhesive or used to waterproof baskets. These materials are not luxury imports so much as threads in a web of visits and gift exchange that connected valleys and coasts. A settled life does not mean a small world. It means a world organized by return visits rather than one-way trips. Numbers are difficult to pin down, but the scale of early Jericho is striking. Imagine a community of several hundred people who can muster dozens of hands to raise a house in a week. Imagine lanes beaten by feet between clusters of round dwellings. Imagine small garden plots near the spring and larger fields, a short walk away where someone posts a watch while others pull weeds. Imagine the soundscape. Reed mats creak underfoot. Querns hum as women grind. Children scrape mud from bricks. Someone flutes on a bone pipe at dusk. The village smells of smoke, damp plaster, and crushed grain. Why here and why now are the big questions. And Jericho offers unusually clear answers. Geography gave water and warmth. The end of the glacial climate gave a longer growing season. Human ingenuity supplied the rest. The people who settled this oasis learned to reshape limestone into plaster, to coax plants into feeding them more reliably, and to store enough to bridge the hungry months. Each small improvement invited a larger one. A plastered floor begs to be swept. A storage bin begs to be filled. A field begs to be weeded and watered. The feedback loop of comfort and obligation is how villages become communities. There were costs. A fixed settlement ties you to cycles of disease that wandering bands may avoid. It makes you attractive to anyone with the nerve to take what you have stored. It creates disputes about fields and water rights. Early Jericho knew those costs. We see them in healed fractures, in layers that hint at flood damage and rebuilding, and in the careful placement of houses to share light and breeze. What we do not see in this first chapter is a garrison mentality. The famous stone tower and the broad slopes of defensive earth come slightly later. The first phase of Jericho is about learning to stay, not learning to fight. From a distance, the earliest Jericho would not look like a city in the modern sense. There are no paved streets or grand temples. There is no market square. There is only a swelling of human intent around a spring. Yet judged by what it took to build and maintain it, judged by the way it organized labor and memory, it is one of the first places on earth that behaves like a town. People here committed to an address. They planted their future alongside the spring and expected their children to inherit both the work and the reward. Centuries later, the mound would sprout projects so large that they still surprise archaeologists. Towers of stone, encircling earthworks, new rituals and new materials. Those are the subjects of the next part. For now, the story is simpler and just as remarkable. A few families camped by good water. They stayed through a winter. They built with mud and stone. They learned to harvest and to store. In doing so, they discovered that a place could hold a community the way a vessel holds grain. When the first generations at Jericho learned to stay, they did not stop at floors and storage bins. They looked outward at the slope that contained the spring, and they remade the landscape itself. The project was audacious for people without metal tools or draft animals. They built a stone wall that circled the settlement and cut a deep ditch in front of it. Inside that circuit, they raised a tower of stone so tall that it still startles visitors who see the photographs from the excavations. The tower rises to about 8 or 9 meters. That is a 3-story building in modern terms, built by villagers who shaped every block with stone hammers and set them one by one in mud mortar. Archaeologists first uncovered the wall and tower in the 20th century while working in the lowest layers of the mound. The wall is made of field stones stacked into a thick barrier, in places more than 1.5 meters across. In front of it is a ditch cut into the marl and limestone. The ditch is several meters wide and a few meters deep and follows the curve of the wall like a shadow. The tower sits just inside the wall. Its base is a circle of fitted stones. Inside is a narrow stair of more than 20 steps that climbs to a platform at the top. The steps are worn smooth along the center line where feet once passed. That detail tells us the tower was not a showpiece built and abandoned. People used it. The first question everyone asks is why? Defense is an obvious guess. A wall and ditch make attackers work hard. Yet there is no clear evidence of armies in this era that could besiege a place. Another practical answer is flood control. Winter storms sometimes rush off the Judean hills and tear through the wadi toward the valley floor. A ditch and a sturdy wall would slow water and hold the settlement edge in place. A third answer lives between practicality and theater. A tower is a stone exclamation point. It is visible from far away. It says this community is organized and strong. It offers a point from which a watch can be kept and a symbol around which stories can be told. A fourth possibility is timekeeping dressed in stone. Some researchers have argued that the tower and the western ridge create a horizon marker that catches the sun at a particular season. Even if the exact alignment is debated, the idea fits the needs of the first farmers. Planting and harvest depend on cycles that must be remembered and shared. A marker that gathers the community at a predictable moment is a calendar you can climb. The stair inside, the narrow entrance, and the small platform on top all suggest performances of some kind. We do not know the words spoken there, but we can imagine the audience. Children looking up, elders leaning on staves, everyone listening for the dates that matter. However we explain its purpose, the tower is a lesson in organization. The stones are heavy. Some weigh more than a strong person can lift alone. The blocks were quarried from the nearby slope and carried to the site. Mud mortar had to be mixed and fetched. The stair had to be set with care so that each tread rested solidly on the one below. The structure had to rise fast enough that seasonal rains did not dissolve unfinished courses. That means a work crew large enough to maintain momentum over many weeks. A reasonable estimate is hundreds of people, with teams for quarrying, carrying, mixing, laying, and finishing. A project of that size implies leadership and scheduling, and it implies food reserves to feed workers who were not out hunting or weeding fields while the wall and tower climbed. The wall and ditch carry similar engineering lessons. Cutting a trench into bedrock with stone picks is slow, repetitive work. It demands patience and a plan to dispose of the spoil. The curve of the ditch is consistent, which means people measured as they cut. The wall behind it is thick and slightly battering, leaning inward to resist pressure. That geometry is not an accident. It is the result of trial and error inherited from earlier, smaller projects, or from the shared craft memory of the region. Even the choice to face the outer surface with larger stones and fill the core with smaller rubble shows a practical understanding of how to make a stable mass from irregular parts. Consider the acoustics and the view from the tower. Atop the platform, a person can see the bend of the wadi, the pale line of the river to the east, and the dark wall of the highlands to the west. A shout from that height carries across the clustered roofs and courtyards. A drumbeat or a horn call would organize labor quickly. The tower is therefore a communications tool as well as a symbol. It ties a community to its perimeter and makes the edge of the settlement audible. If danger approached from the wadi, the watch could warn those in the fields. If a flood began to rise, the call could send people to secure bins and open channels. The wall also defines a social boundary. Inside the circuit are houses, hearths, and graves. Outside are fields, flocks, and strangers. That line matters in a new kind of life where property and storage create temptation. A wall with a single narrow gate turns a cluster of houses into a town with a front door. Gate control creates rules about who enters and when. Rules create councils or elders who enforce them. In that sense, the first architecture of Jericho is the first civics lesson as well. The materials are stone and mud. The outcome is habit and law. Fitting the tower into the timeline of Jericho gives it even more weight. The structure belongs to the earliest Neolithic phase, long before pottery or metal. It is older than the great temples of the Fertile Crescent and older than stone monuments on far-off coasts. It stands at the threshold where villages become more than a survival strategy. In time, the people of Jericho will model their ancestors in plaster and set those faces in places of honor. They will refine their building techniques and learn to terrace the slopes and move water. The tower is an ancestor of those later achievements. It taught them how to gather labor and to sustain a project through setbacks. If you have ever tried to move a stone with friends, you know what such work does to a group. It exhausts and binds. Someone starts the chant that keeps time. Someone finds the better path to the foundation. Someone notices the first hairline crack in a mortar seam and pulls everyone back to reset the course. The victory at the end is not just lifting the top course into place. It is knowing that you all did something that will still be there when your grandchildren climb the stair. That is how monuments create memory before any writing exists. There is one more practical consequence of wrapping a settlement in stone. It changes the way the community thinks about growth. New houses must consider the wall. Lanes must find their way to the gate. Waste must be carried out rather than left to the wind. These constraints produce order. They turn random clusters into neighborhoods. They turn footpaths into streets. At Jericho, that process begins here. The wall and tower are not only big things, they are organizing ideas. Look again at the setting. The spring keeps flowing. The fields beyond the ditch green up after the winter rains. The river flashes silver in the morning light. On the tower, the guard squints along the ridge of the western hills to watch the sun mark its slow passage. The village that began as a clever camp has become a place that expects a future. You can feel it in the stone under your palm and in the view from the top. You can hear it in the sound of footsteps climbing the stair to check the sky and the fields. If the earliest Jericho was a daring experiment in staying put, the Jericho of the early Bronze Age was a proof of concept written in brick and stone. The oasis became a town in the full sense. The small round houses of the first settlers gave way to rectangular rooms organized into neighborhoods. Paths hardened into streets. Storage pits turned into standardized jars stacked in orderly magazines. People still woke to the murmur of the spring, but now the sound mixed with the habits of an urban day. Kilns warmed before dawn. Donkeys clattered through the gate under woven baskets. A scribe pressed a seal into wet clay to mark a delivery that would be counted later. This is the moment when Jericho joins a new world of towns that appeared almost at once across the southern Levant and beyond. It is also the moment when the oasis became the heart of a small economic system rather than a self-contained village. To understand what changed, stand again at the mound that archaeologists call Tel es-Sultan and walk forward in time to about 5,000 years ago. The community that rises here is not an accident. It is the result of a stable water source, a broad fan of arable soil, and the old road that threads the Jordan Valley between higher country to the west and the desert to the east. That road carried obsidian and shells and stories long before. Now it begins to carry commodities at scale. Salt from the Dead Sea, grain from the fields, wool from flocks that graze the steppe in winter and climb the hills in summer, copper ingots that had been hammered into shape far to the north and east. At Jericho, all of this could be taxed, traded, and redirected. Geography made that possible, but organization made it real. The first signal of this new organization is the plan of the town itself. Houses shift from round to rectilinear. Walls align with neighbors in a way that implies a shared idea of the street. Many houses are not single rooms, but suites of spaces arranged around a small court. There are workrooms with raised platforms for grinding and cooking. There are long, narrow rooms where jars stand shoulder to shoulder, each with a pointed base that settles into a ring of clay or into a shallow pit so that the jar will not tip. The change in shape matters. Rectangular rooms stack better. They allow straight runs of roofing timber. They create standard corners where furniture and bins can be tied in. Once you choose a straight wall, you can keep building it. The architecture that results is more than shelter. It is an instrument for dividing labor and controlling goods. A second signal lies in the pottery that fills those rooms. Early bronze potters at Jericho built vessels that are both practical and confident. They have high shoulders and sharp ledges that allow ropes to bite when jars are lashed in place for transport. Some are red-slipped and burnished until they shine like seed coats in the sunday. Others are thick-bodied storage containers with the same capacity repeated over and over. The repetition is the important part. Standard jars make standardized measures. When a delivery of grain arrives at a magazine, one can count full jars rather than guessing at heaps. When grain is issued to workers who are digging a canal or building a wall, a steward can record the number of jars sent out and the number returned empty. The ceramic style is a window into arithmetic and administration. A town needs more than jars to manage surplus. It needs rooms that belong to the community rather than to a family. In this period at Jericho, we begin to see large buildings that are not houses. Some are long halls, with buttressed walls thick enough to carry substantial roofs. Some have plastered floors and carefully set doorways. Their contents are simple: jars, fire pits, grinding stones. But the scale and care tell us that these rooms mattered to many. They are storehouses and gathering places and probably offices in a world without writing on papyrus. Each new course of brick laid on their walls had social weight. You can feel that weight in the way the floors were renewed again and again with smooth white plaster. Each layer assigned receipt from another season of use. The people who ran these buildings were not kings in the way of later ages. They were household heads and lineages and councils. Their power came from crops, herds, and the capacity to move water. Jericho's spring had always been a gift. In the early Bronze Age, it becomes an engineered resource. Channels are cut from the spring toward the fields. Low banks are raised to slow floodwaters that might otherwise tear apart the irrigation grid. Stone revetments protect vulnerable stretches of bank. The modern visitor can still see the graceful sweep of terraces around the oasis and imagine how a few careful cuts could turn a flood into a feeder. This work takes foresight more than force. It takes maps in minds that know every contour. It takes a promise kept that the gate will be guarded while the farmers are in the fields, and that the shared channels will be maintained in the slack days after harvest. Burial customs also change in ways that tell us about identity in an urban world. The older habit of burying the dead under house floors fades. The town concentrates its graves in small cemeteries outside the occupied mound or on its lower skirts, usually in rock-cut chambers that can be opened and reused. Bodies are laid with pottery and small personal items such as beads, pins, and occasionally copper blades. The chambers fill over time, and the remains are rearranged to make room for the newly dead. This practice turns graves into family archives. It also separates daily life from the presence of the dead in a way that speaks to a new sense of public and private. The house becomes a place for the living. Memory moves to the edge of town where it can be visited on the right days and with the right words. Copper appears more often in these layers than before. It is not common, but it is present enough to change tasks that once blunted even the best flint blades. A small chisel cuts a mortise more cleanly than stone. A copper awl pierces heavy leather in fewer strokes. A riveted knife can be resharpened many times. The ore itself did not come from the oasis. It moved along the same paths as salt and wool. Jericho did not smelt in bulk, but it joined a system where mountain valleys in the north and east sent raw metal south toward towns that could pay for it, and where lowland markets could pass the copper on to places like Egypt, where copper was valuable and exotic. Jericho stood near the middle of that web, and the web threaded itself through Jericho's new economy. All of this material life depends on daily habits that are easy to miss in a timeline. We can reconstruct them from the hearths and floors. In one house, a room is set aside for making plaster and repairing jars. The floor is scarred by pits where limestone was heated to make quicklime. The walls are spattered with white and red from mixing slurry and slip. In another building, the floor is a woven mat of reed impressions left in the plaster when bundles were used as a temporary form. These traces show a town that has turned craft into routine. Everyone knows who can fire a stable kiln. Everyone knows who builds doors that do not bind in winter. Everyone knows the trick of rubbing pot rims with a river pebble to harden and sheen the clay before the firing. Out of such routines comes the dependable surplus that can feed a work crew for weeks when the town undertakes something large. Large things do indeed happen. Jericho had long been ringed by earthworks and stone. In the early Bronze Age, that ring is rebuilt and elaborated. A stout stone foundation supports a mud brick wall taller than a person and thick enough that two people can walk along its top. The outer face is fair. The inner face is not fancy but is solid and straight. Where floodwaters threaten, the wall sits behind a shallow ditch that slows the rush. Where approaches are gentle, a glacis of compacted earth is raised outside the wall so that an attacker would climb a steep slope before touching the foundation. This is not the dream of a single builder. It is the work of a generation that knows how to mobilize people when the season allows. The wall is not a perfect circle. It bends to fit the topography and to encompass the spring. That compromise is an engineer's signature. Protect the water first. Draw the line where the line matters most. What were the threats that justified such work? Some were natural. Floods have been mentioned. Earthquakes shake the valley from time to time. A thick wall buttressed by earth absorbs shock better than separate houses do alone. Some threats were human. Trade routes do not attract only merchants. They attract raiders who follow the smell of storage. The wall turns Jericho from a pantry into a fortress when needed. The gate becomes the place where strangers become guests or enemies. A watchman above the gate can see the dust of an approaching caravan from a long way off. He can also see a storm rise in the west and send runners to bring animals inside the wall before the wadi fills. The architecture is defense and administration in a single curve. The early Bronze Age at Jericho is a thick slice of time with its own changes within it. Archaeologists divide it into phases that represent generations of rebuilding and shifting priorities. Early on, houses and granaries spread to fill the sheltered ground nearest the spring. Later, some of those areas are turned over to public buildings while housing pushes a bit farther out, still within the wall. Later still, after a century or two of prosperity, the town contracts and some quarters fall silent. The reasons for contraction are debated. Climate can change the rules in the Jordan Valley, with even a small shift in rainfall patterns. A series of dry years can reduce harvests and make irrigation channels harder to keep clear. Political networks can also fail. A caravan route can be made dangerous by conflict far away, and when goods stop moving, Towns that depend on exchange feel the absence like a pain in the bones. What matters for our story is that Jericho rides these waves and remains occupied for most of this era. It grows, and when it shrinks, it does not disappear. When we look closely at Jericho's early bronze layers, we can watch households adapt intelligently to both bounty and stress. In times of plenty, storage rooms expand and diversify. Not only grain jars, but also smaller containers for dried figs or pressed dates appear. In times when returns are thinner, floors are lifted to cover old hearths and to raise living spaces above damp patches. New drains are cut under thresholds. Courtyards are cobbled with river pebbles to make mud less of a problem during the winter rains. These are not dramatic changes. They are careful responses to daily experience. They show a community that knows its place intimately and refuses to surrender that knowledge to a single crisis. There is an intellectual life here as well, even if the texts are few. Ceilings tell part of that story. A small lump of clay stamped with a distinctive pattern falls from a jar mouth or a storeroom door when the binding cord is cut. Many such lumps survive. Their impressions are tiny works of art, spirals and nets, stylized animals, geometric devices that speak a language of authority no less clearly than a signature on paper. Some of the seals used at Jericho came from other towns and even other regions. That fact hints at marriages between families of different cities and at agreements that extended beyond the town's walls. A seal is a very portable treaty. When one appears in a place far from where it was carved, it carries with it a memory of the hands that once pressed it and the trust that was extended. Trade is where Jericho's urban character stands out most clearly. The town is close to a substance that the rest of the region desires. That substance is salt. The Dead Sea is a cauldron where water only leaves by evaporation. Salt and other minerals that come from its edge can be carried in baskets or in sacks. They are useful for preserving foods and for certain crafts. Jericho's people can send salt north along the valley or west into the highlands. In return, they can receive timber from the wooded slopes, flint of high quality, and woven goods from pastoralists who carry portable looms with them. When the road is safe, some goods go farther. Egyptian travelers and officials occasionally reached into this corridor. Their presence sometimes shows in an imported vessel or a bead of a stone that came from the Nile country. Jericho does not become Egypt's outpost in this period. It becomes a place where many roads converge and where those who manage stores and seals can grow genuinely wealthy. Wealth has visible markers in the archaeological record. The first and simplest is brick. A house that gets taller and larger over time belonged to a family that could gather the labor and the materials to renew it. A second marker is diet. The refuse pits of better houses include more meat. They also include fish bones from the river and from the Dead Sea. A third is jewelry. Faience beads and finely drilled stone beads take time to make. When they are buried with someone, they speak of a family that could spare beauty for the dead. None of this means that Jericho suddenly became a city of palaces. It means that an urban hierarchy develops, with households that take on public roles and households that are their clients, and many people in between who do well in good years and barely hold on in bad ones. Ritual life changes alongside wealth and work. The famous plastered human skulls of Jericho belong to this broad time frame, though scholars argue about the exact sequence. These heads are human crania that have been modeled with plaster to restore faces. Shells serve as eyes. The skulls were kept in houses or in special rooms. They create the uncanny experience of being watched by ancestors. Whether they served as the focus of domestic devotion or marked lineages in public ceremonies, they demonstrate a new investment in durable objects of memory. They also confirm the town's capacity to devote skill to something that does not grind grain or seal jars. Civilization is not just walls and stores. It is the choice to give time to the invisible cords that tie the living to the dead. By the later part of the early Bronze Age, Jericho's urban system is sophisticated enough to interface with powerful neighbors without being swallowed. This is a delicate balance. Towns in the southern Levant learned to maintain local independence by controlling access to water and by offering services to travelers that even a larger power found convenient. A caravan needs a safe place to rest and a reliable place to resupply. A garrison marching up the valley in spring needs fodder and grain. If Jericho can provide these without threatening autonomy, it becomes a node that larger powers will leave alone as long as the services remain dependable. This is not written law. It is practical politics that leaves faint traces in the ground. The traces look like extra storage space near the gate, and like large ovens that can bake many loaves at once. There is a darker side to this arrangement. When neighbors fight, towns on the road can be taken and retaken as pawns. A wall that slows raiders cannot stop an army that brings ladders and time. Archaeologists read destruction layers that belong to this kind of conflict. A layer of ash here, a collapsed wall with fallen bricks still angled as they toppled, a mass of smashed jars in a storehouse. After a sack, survivors sweep and rebuild. Sometimes they rebuild better. Sometimes they accept a smaller footprint and move inward toward the spring. Jericho's advantage is that the oasis itself cannot be carried away. Each time the town is hit, the water waits to make return possible. That is why there are so many layers, and why the story does not end after the first fire. At the street level, the urban day at Jericho must have been a choreography. Imagine the gate at mid-morning. Farmers enter with baskets of cucumbers and onions and fennel. Shepherds lead a few animals to the market pen. A porter with a shaved head and a tattooed wrist, signifying his household contract, slips through with a load of rushes to be woven into mats. Two women from a house near the spring carry a jar between them on a pole and stop often to rest. They pause to hear news from a traveler just arrived from the north who says that a bridge is out near a ford and that the river is high this year. A guard leans on his spear and counts the people who pass. Inside the town, the sun throws bars of light across alleyways where kids chase a stray dog and a cat stares from a roof. You do not need a written account to picture this, because the pattern of rooms and courtyards tells you where the light falls and where the breeze runs. Archaeology is a kind of empathy trained on floors and thresholds. The end of the early Bronze story is not a neat conclusion. Across the southern Levant, many towns contract at roughly the same time near the end of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Jericho's decline is part of that larger pattern. Explanations multiply. Climate again. Trade routes shifting to favor coastal ports. New groups of mobile herders who compete for water and pasture and who sometimes take food stores by force. Earthquakes that crack walls and make people think twice about building tall. It is likely that several of these forces work together. The visible result at Jericho is a thinner occupation spread over a smaller area. Some public buildings go out of use. The wall is repaired in places, but not everywhere. Neighborhoods become isolated clusters. For a while, the town lives at a lower pulse. This is not a failure. It is a pause before a different kind of prosperity that belongs to the Middle Bronze Age. The knowledge that Jericho gained in its early Bronze century and more does not disappear. The skills survive in families and are passed to children. The channels remain where water still seeks the lowest path. The habits of storage and seal use are remembered. The way to stack bricks so that a wall will rise true is taught in gestures more than in words. When the town returns to full strength in the next period, it will do so on the bones of this older city. That is the true legacy of early Bronze Jericho. It transformed an oasis into a place that could forget and remember in cycles and still remain itself. The most important lesson of this period is simple and profound. People at Jericho learned to turn excess into time. A good harvest stored in many jars buys time for projects that do not feed you today but will protect you tomorrow. A wall, a channel, a larger storehouse, a ritual that binds families in mutual help. Time invested this way compounds like interest. It lets a town learn its own tricks and keep improving them. When problems come, as they always do, the stored time can be spent to survive the lean season. This is the arithmetic of urban life. It is as true in a town of mud brick as it is in a city of steel and glass. Stand again at the gate in your mind. Look beyond the wall to the fields where people bend over rows of barley. Listen to the town behind you. Smell the damp cool of the spring air that flows out of the oasis while the surrounding valley bakes. You are standing at a threshold in human history. The first Jericho showed that families could live year-round beside a promise of water. The early Bronze Age Jericho shows that families can combine into a working system that trades, plans, stores, and builds across generations. It is not a city in the later sense. It is something rarer. It is a town that discovered how to survive itself. By the time the calendar reads the early second millennium before the Common Era, Jericho has already rehearsed the basics of town life. In the centuries that follow it, graduates to something harder. The oasis becomes a fortified city-state, a Canaanite stronghold with monumental defenses, wealthy cemeteries, and a political profile that stretches well beyond the spring. The ground will remember this period with the clarity of cut stone. When excavators step down through the mound, the Middle Bronze layers are the ones that announce themselves with scale. That scale is not an accident. It is an answer to a world that is opening and sharpening at the same time. Begin with the walls. Earlier generations ringed Jericho with earth and stone. Middle Bronze builders take that idea and raise it to a science. Imagine approaching the city from the valley floor. Long before you reach houses, you climb a broad sloping embankment made of packed earth. This glacis can stand as high as a 2-story building. It is angled so that it sheds rain and so that loose soil flows downslope rather than undermining the defenses. At the base of the slope stands a revetment of large stones laid in courses. The stones are heavy and unshaped, but they are chosen with care and chocked with smaller pieces so that the wall face rises like a dry waterfall held by gravity and skill. Above the stone revetment stands a mud brick parapet. From a distance, the ensemble reads as a single ring, a man-made ridge that declares the city long before the gate is visible. A glacis has a simple physics lesson built into it. An attacker must climb a steep surface of compacted earth that cannot be undercut easily. He is exposed to whatever the defenders throw. The slope channels energy from above into the ground, and the stone facing absorbs the push of both water and men. This is engineering without iron, as clever as any calculus. The builders learned how to achieve these effects by iteration. Middle Bronze Jericho shows layers of rebuilds and repairs where sections were maintained or thickened after heavy rains. The work is cumulative. Each season adds another course or another skin to the slope. The result is a perimeter that is both mass and message. It says that this place can mobilize a labor force at will and can feed them while they work. Gates mark the places where such a perimeter allows the outside world to pass. In this period, the main entrance into Jericho is not a simple hole. Gates are pieces of architecture with rooms, benches, and guard stations built into them. The approach road is channeled so that carts and animals must slow and turn. The pavement is made of packed gravel and carefully set stones. Ruts from carts cut grooves that are still visible when the excavation opens them to the Sunday. Passing through the gate is a ritual of submission to the city. Toll keepers count. Scribes or stewards press ceilings on jars. Guards lean spears where everyone can see them. Gates also set the rhythm of the day. They open at first light and close when the sun dips behind the ridge. Late arrivals camp outside and watch the lamps atop the parapet until morning. Horses and chariots enter the Levantine story in this period. The earliest evidence is scattered, but by the later Middle Bronze Age, the use of light chariots had become a symbol of elite military power. Whether Jericho fielded a chariot unit is not something the ground can answer with certainty, but the city would have known of them and perhaps hosted traveling contingents. The wide approach roads and the open spaces inside the walls could accommodate such traffic. More broadly, the shift to faster warfare on wheels is one reason that cities invested in massive earthworks. The glacis and revetment system does not only defeat ladders, it defeats speed. It forces enemies to slow down and play the defender's game at the gate. Within the city, the craft base becomes more specialized. The pottery repertoire of the period includes forms that are often interpreted as tableware for feasts and forms that are clearly suited for bulk storage. The most refined pieces have thin walls and carefully controlled firing that produces a tight ring when tapped. Kiln waste found in backfilled pits shows that some firings failed and that potters learned by trial and error to balance fuel, temperature, and atmosphere. Metalworking leaves small signatures. Drops of copper alloy caught in the floor plaster at the edge of a hearth, a mold fragment, a thin film of green corrosion on a discarded tool. Textiles also leave their shadows. Loom weights, spindle whirls, and impressions of woven cloth in dried mud where a basket once Saturday. These clues point to households that divided labor by skill and to neighborhoods where certain crafts clustered. Religious life is harder to fix in buildings, but a few patterns are clear. Small sanctuaries appear beside major streets, modest rooms with benches and offering tables where people left jars of oil or food to mark vows or to give thanks. Within houses, the older Levantine habit of placing family figurines near hearths continues. Clay female figures with emphasized features are common across the region and probably represent a form of household piety that blesses fertility and protection. At a higher level of display, the city would have staged public rituals keyed to the agricultural calendar. Processions to the gate at harvest time. Libations poured at the spring on the day the canal was opened to water the first fields. The testimony for these events is indirect, but a city that organizes labor this well will also organize meaning, and the precincts and courtyards give the necessary stages. The rhythm of the year meshes civic and rural work. In late winter, when rains are still likely, the city devotes labor to the glacis and the revetment, repairing scours and rebuilding steps that lead up to patrol paths on the parapet. In spring, attention shifts to the fields and to orchards of date and fig. In early summer, threshing floors inside the walls turn golden with chaff as oxen tread circles over sheaves and workers toss grain into the evening breeze to winnow it. In late summer, the storehouses are tallied, ceilings are applied, and distributions are planned. Autumn brings pruning and the first repairs to channels as water levels change. Each season has its civic tasks. The wall is not a sculpture. It is a calendar of maintenance. Despite all this order, the Middle Bronze world is not stable. The very networks that enrich cities also expose them to wider shocks. A rival may choose to raid caravans. A drought may reduce harvests across a region and force towns to draw down stores at the same time. A corridor that once carried trade may carry an army instead. The archaeological record at Jericho preserves more than one episode of violent destruction in the later Middle Bronze and early Late Bronze strata. The signature is familiar across Levantine sites. Charred timbers fallen across floors, collapsed brick that still shows the imprint of wooden beams burned from within, a scatter of smashed vessels. In tombs, disturbances where burials were rifled or where hurried interments followed a catastrophe. When Kathleen Kenyon studied Jericho's mound in the middle of the 20th century, she argued that the great Middle Bronze city met a final destruction near the time when Egypt reunited and pushed military power back into southern Canaan. Whether Jericho fell to an Egyptian campaign or to a regional conflict, the end of this stronghold came with fire. The end is not the whole story. A city that has trained itself to store and to repair does not vanish with one blow. After the destruction, the site shows attempts to resettle. The footprint is smaller. The walls are reused rather than rebuilt to full height. The pottery changes to forms more typical of the early Late Bronze period. Certain imports become common, including decorated vessels from Cyprus, whose painted bands and birds tell of a sea network that is now ascendant. But the Middle Bronze flood has receded. Its energy and unmistakable voice are trapped in the ramparts and the tomb shafts. If you had walked Jericho's streets during the Middle Bronze height, you would have felt the confidence that comes from collective competence. Children would have chased one another along lanes that smelled of warm brick and crushed herbs. Porters would have steadied shoulder poles under the weight of oil jars and leaned to the same cadence at every turn. At the gate, traders would have waited under an awning while a steward counted measures and pressed a seal into the clay fastening on a sack. And if the midday sun had drawn you up the inner stair to the wall walk, you could have looked out over the glacis and watched dust rise from the valley road as a line of donkeys came in with sacks of salt or resin slung like saddlebags. A city that can make that vision routine is a city that has mastered its landscape. The archaeological details that allow us to reconstruct this scene are not romantic. They are stubborn and physical. The angle of a rampart that refuses to crumble when re-exposed to rain after thousands of years in the ground. The plan of a gate whose proportions make sense to a body that has to swing a door and check a wagon wheel. The standardized volumes of jars that let a steward think in consistent units. The reopened tomb where a bronze dagger lies in the crumbled dust at a child's feet and reminds us that even grief was organized by custom. Put together, these fragments yield a city that was many things at once. It was a bulwark against raids. It was a clearinghouse for goods. It was a stage for family pride. It was an idea that the land itself could be shaped to serve a community year after year. Jericho's Middle Bronze chapter matters for more than local reasons. It shows that city making in the Levant was not a copy of distant models. The glacis fortification is a local solution to local soils, weather, and war. The rock-cut tomb is a local ritual logic for linking the living to their line. The flow of scarabs and imported jars through its cemeteries signals a confident participation in a regional system without surrendering identity. When later texts praise Canaanite cities for their strength and their wealth, they are describing a world that Jericho helped define. The strength did not make the city immortal. Late in the Middle Bronze period, the network shifted against it. Power in Egypt consolidated and moved to subdue or reshape the Levant. Trade patterns bent toward ports that could serve ships more easily than inland towns could. New centers rose elsewhere, yet the blueprint of how to hold an oasis and how to turn water into law remained. The walls would fall. The slope would erode and be rebuilt in later times on different lines. The tomb shafts would be sealed. But the memory of a Canaanite stronghold persists in the way the mound itself holds its shape. Even eroded, it still reads like the shoulder of a giant under a cloak. If you stand at the spring today and let your mind roll back the layers, you can still feel the logic of that older city. The low ground near the water is the place for houses. The firm slope just above is the place for walls. The path that skirts the mound is still the natural road through the valley. The Middle Bronze builders read those lines keenly. They turned them into the grammar of a city that could organize people, knowledge, stone, and water into a living sentence that lasted centuries. That is what a stronghold really is. It is grammar that can be spoken by many voices and still mean the same thing. Stand at the foot of the tell in late afternoon and let the sun skim the flanks of the mound. The light catches a broken geometry that looks almost like a frozen wave. It is a stone revetment at the base, and above it, a slope where mud brick once sat in ordered ranks. This is the Jericho of legend, translated into stratigraphy. In one layer, you can still follow the story that generations learned as a lesson about trumpets and faith. In the next layer, the story becomes a ledger of grain and cracked jar rims and a timeline written in ash. The task is to read both together with respect for what each kind of evidence can and cannot say. The biblical account in the book of Joshua is succinct and theatrical. A walled city, a ritual circuit for 7 days, priests bearing a sacred chest, trumpets, a shout, collapse, a ban on spoils that is as much theology as law. It is an unforgettable scene. For more than a century, archaeologists have walked up the mound at es-Sultan with that scene in mind, spade in one hand and pottery typology in the other. The result is not a simple confirmation or a simple refutation. It is a conversation between text and ground that has sharpened our understanding of both. To see why, we have to back up into the layers that precede any possible conquest. The great city that lies behind the legend belongs to the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Its builders raised a perimeter system that was one of the best of its time. A deep stone revetment wall at the foot of the mound. A steep glacis of packed earth rising above that. A mud brick wall sitting atop the glacis like a crown. Inside the perimeter, the city spread in dense quarters, with storehouses and lanes, and the kind of administrative rooms where ceilings accumulated like fallen leaves. The cemetery around the mound tells the same story of wealth and organization. Rock-cut chambers, repeat burials by lineages, scarab seals and decorated vessels that tie Jericho into the broader world of Canaan and Egypt. That city met a violent end. This is not a matter of opinion. It is a layer you can touch. Excavators describe a burn stratum that is thick and continuous. with fallen timbers charred to charcoal and brickwork that slumped while it was still hot. The slope outside the revetment is peppered with the debris of mud brick walls that fell outward, cascading down the stone face. Inside house after house, jars lay smashed across floors and shelves. In many rooms, the jars were still full when fire came. Charred barley and wheat are everywhere, blackened but preserved by the very heat that destroyed the roofs. The abundance of stored grain tells two things at once. First, the catastrophe was sudden. There was no long siege during which stores were eaten day by day. Second, it likely took place not long after harvest, when bins and jars were full. Those facts are friendly to the broad strokes of a conquest scene. An army that arrives just after harvest would find full storehouses. A capture by storm and fire would leave more grain than a slow hunger would. But archaeology is a discipline of clocks. The crucial question is when this destruction took place. If it can be shown to match the period in which the people of Israel, as described in the Bible, were moving through the highlands and down into the valley, then one kind of alignment is possible. If the destruction is older, then the legend would be best read as memory set on a stage that was already ruins. During the first generation of scientific excavation at Jericho, John Garstang believed he had found the city of Joshua and a destruction that he dated to around 1400 years before the Common Era. His explanation rested on the styles of pottery he recovered and on certain Egyptian objects in the area. Garstang was a careful and pioneering field archaeologist, yet he worked at a time when ceramic chronologies for the region were still being assembled. 20 years later, Kathleen Kenyon returned with a new approach that emphasized controlled stratigraphy and close attention to the fine sequence of pottery types. Her trenches cut straight sections through the mound, like pages sliced away from a book. In those layered pages, she showed that the great Middle Bronze city was destroyed about a century and a half earlier than Garstang thought. In her reading, the last true city at the Tell burned at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, around 15.5 centuries before the Common Era. After that, the mound saw small-scale occupation and reuse of tombs, but did not carry a fortified town in the period when Joshua would have approached. Kenyon's revised date gained weight from two independent kinds of evidence. First, the pottery that belongs to the late Bronze Age I is essentially absent in the destruction level of the great city. The familiar imported styles that mark that period in other towns, especially certain Cypriot wares, do not appear in the burn stratum at the Tell. Instead, the repertoire belongs to a Middle Bronze world. Second, later radiocarbon measurements on charred grain from the destruction layer converged on a date near the end of the Middle Bronze Age. That scientific clock agreed with the ceramic clock and with the logic of regional history in which several fortified towns met their ends as political networks shifted and Egypt pressed into southern Canaan. Not every scholar has accepted this as the last word. A prominent re-evaluation by Bryant Wood argued that Kenyon's ceramic interpretations were too strict and that the destruction could be placed nearer to 14 centuries before the Common Era after all. In his view, certain local forms were misread and some imported styles could have been present but missed. He emphasized the outward tumble of the walls and the great quantity of grain as features that match the biblical account well, along with an interpretation of Egyptian scarab sequences from nearby burials. His critique sparked a debate that is still cited in surveys of Near Eastern archaeology, because it illustrates how methods and assumptions shape conclusions. The radiocarbon dates remain a stubborn counterpoint. Short-lived plant remains, especially charred cereal grains sealed within a destruction layer, are considered reliable anchors. When those dates cluster around the same century, it becomes difficult to move a city's end forward by 100 years without remarkable additional evidence. The absence of typical late bronze imports in the burn also continues to sway many scholars. The debate has been useful even when it has not changed minds. It has forced everyone to be precise about definitions and generous in letting the ground speak for itself. A different line of inquiry asks not when the city fell, but how. The outward tumble of the mud brick above the stone revetment has often been flagged as intriguing. It suggests that the wall did not simply erode gently downward, but that it collapsed catastrophically, at least in sections. Fire can cause that if timbers within the wall burn through. An earthquake can do it even more efficiently. The Dead Sea Transform is a real and active fault system. Jericho sits within a landscape where earthquakes are part of the long-term pattern. It is plausible that a seismic event helped bring down parts of the wall, either as a main cause or as a companion to fire and assault. This does not disprove a human attack, nor does it prove one. It simply reminds us that nature often plays a hand in disasters recorded by human memory. If we return to the biblical account with this layered understanding in mind, certain features glow with fresh context. The instruction to devote the city to destruction rather than plunder would match a scene where grain is left to burn and jars to crack. The insistence that the walls fell flat has a poetic force that may take its metaphor from a very literal physics of brick sliding down a steep face. The mention of a house built into the wall where a woman named Rahab sheltered spies lines up with the reality that cities often had dwellings built close to or even anchored into a perimeter. None of these resonances prove identity between the archaeological layer and the narrative. They show how stories absorb the physical logic of real places. The question of occupation at the right time remains. If we follow the common reconstruction in which the Exodus and subsequent movements of highland groups took place in the 13th century before the Common Era, then Jericho at Tel es-Sultan offers little as a target. The mound shows limited reuse of the cemetery and some ephemeral structures, but no fortified city with a running gate and a ring of houses. The legendary scene would then be set on memory and geography rather than on a specifically occupied town. If we adopt an earlier chronology for the arrival of Israelites in the land, one that places a conquest near 14 centuries before the Common Era, then a small window opens in which Garstang's original intuition might find support. That window narrows again when the radiocarbon and ceramic clocks are set side by side. Most historians today therefore conclude that the dramatic destruction that the mound remembers belongs to the end of the Middle Bronze world, and that the later narrative draws on that ruin as a stage even if the cast belongs to a later time. There is another way to read the relationship between the text and the tell. Rather than tying the story to one destruction event, we can see Jericho as a symbol for the idea of a first step into a promised land. Jericho is the lowest city on earth by elevation, and among the earliest to have built walls and towers. It stands where desert and sown land meet. Confronting it first in a narrative about taking possession is a literary choice that feels right whether or not the gate was manned in that exact year. When the story says the first obstacle fell, it chooses the place that had taught the region the very art of building a wall. This is not a dismissal of history. It is a recognition that history and meaning often intertwine. What the archaeology gives us in the meantime is vivid in its own right. We can walk a room where the last Jericho city burned and scoop a handful of carbonized barley kernels from a corner where a jar broke as the roof fell. We can trace the sinuous face of the stone revetment and imagine the line of a ladder set against the mud brick wall above it, while defenders shouted at men climbing with shields. We can stand in the mouth of a rock-cut tomb and feel the cool air of a space where a family rearranged bones to make a place for one more person when their time came. We can pick up a small lump of clay impressed with a scarab and think about the day a steward sealed a storeroom door, pressed the seal into the wet clay with a practiced twist, and walked away without any idea that his neat sign would harden into evidence for future scholars. Then the curtain falls. After the fire, the tell is quiet for a long time. The cemetery is not entirely abandoned. Some tombs continue to accept burials, and a few new interments appear with objects that belong to the late Bronze world. On the mound itself there are hearths and small structures, but nothing like the city that came before. Travelers still follow the valley. They will have seen the oasis and perhaps camped by the spring. The town is not there to take toll or to entertain guests with bread and dates. When the Iron Age arrives centuries later, a modest settlement appears again on the mound. By then, the walls of the older city are ancient memory eroding in the Sunday. The biblical narrative comes from a tradition that remembers Jericho as a point of entry and a test. The mound remembers it as a place that burned and then slept. The story of Joshua at Jericho, therefore, lives in a fruitful tension with the ground. The text carries theological purpose and public memory. The mound carries the physics of brick and heat and time. The two are not enemies. Each corrects the other's excesses. The ground restrains the vaulting wish to tie every verse to a trench. The text restrains the dry habit of reducing a city to a list of sherds and measurements. Together they let us see ancient Jericho with depth that neither alone can achieve. If we return once more to that late afternoon light on the revetment, the scene feels less like a puzzle to be solved and more like an honest landscape through which several stories run. A Neolithic tower that taught people how to organize, a Canaanite stronghold that raised earth into law, a biblical lesson that placed courage and obedience at the beginning of a journey, a sequence of excavations that taught archaeology how to argue through evidence. All of it sits in one place where a spring insists on flowing. That insistence is the oldest plot device in Jericho's narrative. It is why there was always something here to find and something to say. This return to small-scale occupation raises another question. Where exactly did later people put their houses in the Jericho landscape when they did not want to live atop the ruin layers? The answer that emerges as the story moves forward is that settlement shifted to nearby ground, with better access to the spring and with less debris to fight. The tell was still a landmark, but it was not the only option. Around the oasis there were natural terraces that could carry new farms and lanes, without the heavy work of leveling a mound that had built up from millennia of walls and floors. When we get to the classical centuries, the great building projects do not climb the old mound. They rise beside the spring on fresh ground. The seeds of that shift are already present in the centuries after the fire, even if the big palaces and gardens are still far in the future. The written record adds its own sparse lines to this chapter. The late Bronze Age produced a cache of letters between Canaanite rulers and the Egyptian court, written in Akkadian on clay tablets. These Amarna letters mention many towns in turmoil. The correspondence is full of pleas for archers and protests about neighbors and complaints about Habiru raiders. Jericho is not an actor in that chorus. Its name does not appear with the regularity of places like Megiddo or Shechem or Hazor. Silence in a diplomatic archive is not proof of absence, but it fits the archaeological picture of a site that no longer commanded a seat at the regional table. The Hebrew Bible continues to remember Jericho, but the memories move from the fortress on the mound to the oasis as a region. It is called the City of Palms. It becomes a directional marker in stories of judges and kings. This is what geography does to memory. When a stronghold is gone, the enduring feature takes its place in language. People do not forget the spring. They rename the space around it to match the life it still provides. An empty citadel can still cast a long shadow in story if the road runs past it. The physical mound is useful as a watchpoint and as a source of stacked stone. The social city lives nearby where the water is easiest to reach. There is a quieter change to notice in the way the ground accumulates. In a thriving town, every windstorm is followed by sweeping and disposal. The debris ends up in dumps outside the walls or in deliberate fills under new floors. In an under-occupied site, the wind claims the alleys. Dust moves without being stopped by a broom. Light sand and silt settle in corners, then crust over in the next rain, then trap the next layer. After a decade of that pattern, a courtyard will look as if it was deliberately filled. After a century, a doorway is a memory line in a wall that now rises only knee-high. Archaeologists have a term for the thin, loose layers that drift into abandoned spaces: colluvium and aeolian wash. It is geology making pages over a book that no one bothers to read. Jericho's quiet centuries are written in just such pages. The cemetery keeps the clearest trail through this lull. Some family tombs remain in use for generations after the last city burned. New offerings in late Bronze and early Iron Age styles appear among the older bones. Often these are not lavish by the standards of the earlier Middle Bronze chambers. They are a jug or two, a bowl, a personal ornament that meant much to the living and was given in farewell. This continuity matters in a way that finds do not always show at a glance. It means that families held the thread of identity even as the built city unraveled. The maintenance of tombs requires memory. Memory requires gatherings. The oasis was still a gathering place. Erosion and quarrying altered the profile of the mound during these centuries in ways that complicate our reading today. When a city is abandoned or only lightly occupied, people often take bricks from older walls to make new structures. Mud brick is a valuable resource when you need to patch a roof or build a one-room shelter. Each missing course flattens the tell a little. Rain then follows new paths down interrupted faces. The even planes that a careful builder once plastered and maintained become irregular steps. In the modern trench, these processes produce confusion for anyone who expects intact walls everywhere. The Middle Bronze ramparts are still visible because they were built from stone and massive earth. Many later walls are ghosts. The absence is not proof that no one built. It is the combined effect of reuse and weather across long centuries when there were no budgets for grand repairs. What did daily life look like for those who stayed? Small gardens around the spring. Small flocks led to graze in the low hills and to drink at the channels cut from the source. A pattern of seasonal movement between the oasis and outlying plots that needed watchmen more than walls. Modest exchange with neighbors. A pot of date syrup boiled down and swapped for a tool repair. A skin of water left for a traveler in exchange for news. Children who climbed on the old rampart and learned to call the slopes by names that their grandparents used when pointing out landmarks. A life in which the ancient city was a presence rather than a place you went every day. From the point of view of a historian, it is tempting to label this a gap before the next big chapter. That can hide the real work that communities do between bursts of monumental building. The people of this period kept channels open. They kept palms trimmed and productive. They kept burial customs alive. They carried forward recipes for plaster, for bread, for simple jar forms that turned up again in later periods with only modest changes. They remembered paths that would matter when rulers with more resources returned and wanted to landscape the oasis into a garden worthy of a court. We should give the final word of this part to the landscape itself. Stand at the base of the tell and face the spring. The Judean hills stand dark to the west. To the east, the valley opens toward the river and the Dead Sea. The air is dry and warm even in winter. You can hear water if you listen. You can also hear nothing at all when the wind drops. That is the sound of an empty citadel after a fane burning. It is not a tragic silence. It is a waiting silence. The road remains. The palms do what palms have always done. People come and go. They leave little signatures in the dirt that are easy to miss unless you know where to look. Later centuries will look, and they will find enough to remind them that the spring never stopped being generous, even when the mound slept. Walk down from the old tell toward the spring, and you feel the story shift under your feet. The city that once huddled on the mound with its earthworks and broken revetments gives way to a broad green basin where water moves easily and the air feels a degree softer than the country around it. This is where Jericho reinvented itself in the Hellenistic and early Roman ages. The stronghold became a garden city. Kings and high priests moved their winters here, not to stare at walls, but to live among palms and water stairs, tiled baths and shaded courts. The landscape began to look like a promise kept. The word palace did not mean a lonely throne in a stone hall. It meant a complex organism of orchards, pools, aqueducts, kitchens, storerooms, porticos and pleasure rooms that ran on water and labor and skill. Begin with the move itself. The center of gravity slid off the old tell to the low mounds to its southwest along Wadi Kelt, a ravine that brings winter water down from the highlands toward the oasis. The Arabic name Tulul Abu el Alayik means the little hills of the vine branches, and the name fits. Here, the Hasmonean rulers of Judea chose to build country residences in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. The choice was practical and symbolic at once. Practical because the ground here was open for spacious plans and near enough to the spring for easy water capture. Symbolic because a new dynasty wanted to step away from the broken silhouette of older cities and show that it could fashion a paradise from a bare floodplain. Archaeology has given us the bones of those first palaces. Excavations directed by Ehud Netzer and others traced out long halls with plastered floors, columned courtyards that breathed in the evening, and a lacework of channels and basins that turned the desert edge into a controllable garden. One trick appears again and again. Water is admitted at a high point, divided in shallow stone-lined rills, and led past rooms and open yards so that it can be seen and heard while it does useful work. It fills a reservoir for animals. It cools the air as it slips along shade. It feeds a sunken garden where trees root below wind level and draw heat back up into the cool night. It moves from use to use and then drops into a larger pool where silt settles before the next task. The palace is a hydrological diagram you can walk. The Hasmonean builders left the clearest fingerprints in their ritual installations. Alongside banqueting rooms and audience courts, they built many stepped immersion pools. These mikvot are deep enough to cover a person standing upright, lined with fine plaster, and fed by clean water that could be drained and refilled. They show a court that took purity laws seriously, even while adopting some of the Mediterranean language of luxury. In the storerooms nearby, amphorae with stamped handles and imported tablewares show up among plainer local jars. The mix tells the story of a court that could both entertain foreign envoys and observe its own customs without hesitation. The garden was an economic machine as much as a setting. Jericho's microclimate nurtured groves of date palms and stands of balsam. Dates fed people and animals and sweetened food in a world without cane sugar. Balsam, the resin tapped from shrubs grown here, supplied a perfume and a medicinal oil that the ancient Mediterranean prized. Writers could not resist its fame. The resin appears in lists of royal goods. The shrubs are mentioned as a monopoly guarded by the court. The groves were not natural thickets that anyone could raid. They were managed assets with overseers, guards, and skilled workers who knew how to score bark and collect sap without killing the plant. The Hasmoneans understood what they had. They turned the oasis into a royal estate that could pay soldiers and purchase friends. History then did what it always does. It brought new players to the garden. In the last generation of the Hasmonean line, the young high priest Aristobulus was invited to bathe at Jericho. He never left the water alive. His death, by drowning in a palace pool, became a scandal that stuck to the name of Herod, the Idumean aristocrat whose rise would change the map of Judea. The story matters not only for its palace intrigue, but for what it tells us about the setting. That there were pools large enough to swim is certain. That a court party of priests and nobles could move from banqueting to bathing without leaving the complex shows how completely the palace absorbed daily life. Herod the Great learned from the Hasmoneans and then outdid them. Jericho became one of his favorite winter capitals. He did not just refurbish the old rooms, he built anew in phases that can still be traced. The first Herodian palace rose near the earlier complex and presented visitors with a new vocabulary of power. Thick walls framed an open peristyle court. Rooms were arranged in axial views that let a guest admire and be impressed before they had time to lower their eyes. Bath suites followed the Roman sequence of hot, warm, and cold, with underfloor heating in the hot room, vaulted spaces to hold the steam, and mosaic floors that could survive repeated wetting. Frescoed walls reproduced marbles and architectural vistas in paint. It was a house that performed daily, even when no delegation stood waiting at the gate. Nature reminded the king where he lived. In 31 before the Common Era, a severe earthquake shook the Jordan Valley. It brought down walls, broke aqueducts, and likely damaged the first Herodian palace. Recovery at Jericho was swift because the royal treasury stood behind the plan. Herod did not abandon the site. He built again and bigger, using what the quake had taught. A second palace, followed by a third, rose along the banks of Wadi Kelt, each set a little differently to take advantage of grade and view. One plan straddled the ravine with a bridge, so that the palace literally joined its two halves across water. This daring arrangement made the stream part of the architecture. It is a real river when winter rains run. To inhabit both banks at once is to say that the court controls not only land but flow. The new works expanded the scale of water features. Pools grew large enough that modern visitors compare them to public baths. Some were formal rectangles with staircases, descending in broad runs on all four sides. Others were basins linked by channels that let water move in sequence through rooms. The fresh water in the middle of a semi-desert was not merely a pleasure, it was a climate device. A large pool cools the air as it evaporates, and the air heavy with vapor drifts under porticos where people recline. A palace tuned in this way is an instrument played by winter and spring. The gardens did not only cool and perfume, they produced. Date harvests rolled in through service gates, spread to dry in sun squares, and moved to storerooms where jars waited to be filled. Balsam groves generated a higher value stream controlled directly by royal agents. The court managed the labor with the same care it gave to festivals. Supervisors measured out rations. Scribes marked amounts and destinations on tags of clay and wood. Guards watched gates. There is a reason ancient authors wrote that the revenues of Jericho were coveted by queens and generals. Cleopatra received the royal estates of Jericho as a gift from Mark Antony during the last storms of the Roman Republic, and then leased them back to Herod for a handsome fee. After the battle that made Augustus master of the Mediterranean, the estates returned to Herod. The garden remained at the center of larger politics. Herod's Jericho was not just a farm with fancy rooms. It was a node in a system of roads and festivals. The road to Jerusalem climbs from the oasis through a succession of ridges. That climb is steep and can be done in a day by strong travelers. Caravans and courtiers needed staging. Jericho supplied that with courtyard inns and barracks that doubled as storehouses. Herod added a hippodrome on the estate grounds, a track where horses and chariots could display speed and where the court could stage public shows. A theater has been proposed in the same landscape, a place where larger audiences could sit in ranks under the winter Sunday. These entertainments were not afterthoughts. They were the way a ruler presented himself as the author of order and pleasure in a world that had recently been battered by civil wars. The archaeological traces of this brilliance are oddly human. A line of ashlar blocks with drafted margins that carry the polished echo of many hands. A threshold engraved by years of sand and sandals. Mosaic tesserae that have fallen away from their bed and huddle in drifts on the floor like a tiny rockfall. Fragments of painted wall plaster that record while they crumble. A broken ring from a finger worn by someone who swept through rooms that are now open to the sky. No one saw these things as future evidence. They were just the parts of a working house. The fact that they still speak is the best measure of how thoroughly water and stone held a court together. Herod himself had reasons to love this city. Jericho promised relief from the cold winds of the highlands. The air at the oasis in winter is soft and medicinal. When illness closed in on him near the end of his life, he came here and then sought the hot springs across the valley at Caliro, where the mineral waters rise near the Dead Sea. He died shortly after returning to Jericho. A funeral procession carried him away up the road toward Herodium, the fortress tomb he had raised on a conical hill south of Jerusalem. That long final climb from the palms to the high country is one of those scenes that always belonged to this city. A ruler could love the green basin, but the kingdom was kept on the ridges. The road between them is a ruler's biography in miniature. After Herod, the gardens did not disappear. Administration changed hands. The estate passed to his son Archelaus for a short time, then to direct Roman control when Archelaus was deposed. Governors and officers moved through, and the winter quarter remained a reward for service. The pattern of planting and pruning went on because the craft and the channels persisted. The palace rooms were repaired or repurposed, less splendid than during their first decades, but still able to satisfy the basic craving that made the place valuable. The river did not forget its banks. Plain numbers help fix the scale of the whole system. A mature date palm can produce dozens of kilograms of fruit in a season. A grove of thousands of trees could supply local needs and create a surplus that moved along the valley roads. Balsam yields are smaller but far more valuable. A small amphora of resin might match a wagon of grain in price. Jericho's prosperity, therefore, came from a deliberate diversification. Grain grew where it was safe to sow and harvest. Gardens produced fruit and vegetables. Palms provided food and shade. Balsam delivered luxury. The palace presided over all these as a clearinghouse and a guarantee. The most delightful detail of the palatial landscape is the way it staged daily life as a series of framed views. A visitor passed from the glare of the outer court through a shaded portico into a space where water moved in a narrow rill along a polished curb. Ahead opened a triclinium, a dining room where couches lined three sides so that guests could recline and talk while attendants circulated. Off to one side, a bath suite glowed like a promise. Down a flight of steps lay a garden sunk below grade where wind dropped and citrus trees could thrive. Around a corner, a service passage ran to the kitchens where fires never went out. Architecture choreographed mood, even more than movement. The garden city was a theater kind to its players. None of this would have survived even a few seasons without constant attention. The aqueducts that brought water from the spring and from the Wadi Kelt had to be cleared of silt after every winter storm. Their channels had to be recoated with lime plaster whenever hairline cracks appeared. Pools needed scrubbing and the occasional sealing with a fresh coat of mortar. Trees demanded pruning and protection from pests. The place was a calendar in stone and wood. Maintenance was not a burden foisted on tired workers by a demanding court. It was the substance of the court's continued existence. The most serious ritual at Jericho was the yearly choice to keep the water moving smoothly. The contrast with the old mound could not be sharper. The tale is a memory of defense and sudden catastrophe captured in layers of brick and ash. The palace quarter at Jericho is a memory of continuity built around water. The shift from one to the other did not mean that war had ended. The region always had its storms. It meant that in this period, a dynasty could afford to display control by managing pleasure as well as peril. To say that the city was a garden was not to soften its history. It was to name the technology that made authority look natural. If you stand in the palace ruins today on a quiet winter afternoon, you can still assemble the experience with the pieces that remain. The sun reaches a wall coated in smooth white plaster that caught it once like a pool. The air carries the faint sweetness of date and dust. Down the slope, the line of an aqueduct shows as a low bank that refuses to erode like the ground beside it. Children run along it because it is smooth and level, which is almost certainly what children did when Herod walked here. The garden city is not entirely gone. Enough of its grammar survives that a visitor can still read. The garden city that Herod perfected did not end with him. It changed costumes as empires changed banners, and it learned to speak the languages of faith that arrived along the roads. Palm groves and aqueducts kept their quiet logic. Administrators came and went. What deepened was the sense that Jericho was a hinge between the desert and the uplands, and between the sacred and the ordinary. You can track that shift in the way stories attach to the place and in the way buildings gather the faithful. Begin with Rome in charge. After Herod, the oasis became an imperial estate managed by officials who kept ledgers beside the pools. Jericho sat within a district that Roman administrators called a toparchy, a bundle of villages and fields that owed tax in kind and coin. An officer with a taste for order could stand in the shade and watch caravans count their way in. Salt and bitumen from the Dead Sea moved through, along with dates and balsam that were valued far beyond the valley. The old Hasmonean palaces and the newer Herodian wings were repaired and repurposed, and a small garrison kept the gate to the Jerusalem road honest. The road itself rose steeply from the oasis in a sequence of bends and terraces. Milestones and small forts guarded it. A traveler could pass 3 climates in a single day, leaving warm air and citrus for wind that smelled of stone and pine as the ridge approached. The empire did not bring only officials. It brought new audiences and new texts. The Gospels anchor episodes here that have layered the oasis with a particular kind of memory. The story of a tax collector named Zacchaeus climbing a sycamore to see an itinerant teacher who entered Jericho is simple and vivid. It fixes a tree and a road in the mind. Another scene follows the road up toward Jerusalem and tells of a traveler set upon by thieves who is helped by a stranger others would have ignored. The valley and the wadi fit that parable perfectly. Gorges cut by winter torrents run like open wounds toward the city in the hills. Anyone who walks there understands at once why a story about kindness would choose this climb as its stage. Archaeology adds a quieter counterpoint to those texts. Synagogues appear in and around the oasis during the late Roman and early Byzantine centuries, the centuries when Judaism and Christianity both set deep roots in the region. One synagogue at Jericho is remembered by the mosaic floor that survived long after its roof fell. The floor carries a central panel with a 7-branch lampstand flanked by ritual items and an inscription that bids peace on Israel. Another synagogue at nearby Naran displays a mosaic carpet with animals, fruits, and geometric panels, along with a dedicatory text that names donors and asks for their good life. Mosaics like these are not theological treatises. They are records of local pride and of a community that could gather resources to lay colored stone into durable designs. They show an oasis where craftspeople could make beauty on commission and where patrons wanted that beauty under their feet. Christian communities grew along the same lines. Pilgrims came for the Jordan and for the memories attached to the desert edge. The river bends near Jericho and makes a natural approach to water that fed a new ritual life. Baptism at the place where the river slows and broadens became a magnet for travelers from many lands. They left small tokens and recorded their visits in lists and itineraries. The Madaba map, a 6th century floor mosaic in a church east of the Jordan, shows Jericho as a cluster of red-roofed buildings amid palms, labeled and easily recognized. It is a charming detail, and it reminds us that in late antiquity the oasis had a cartographic identity. If you were a pilgrim or a merchant and you saw that map, you could point to Jericho and know what awaited you there. Hermits and monks claimed the cliffs of Wadi Kelt as their own theater of devotion. The rock faces above the stream carry caves and ledges that invited solitude. In the 5th and 6th centuries, dedicated men carved cells and chapels into those walls and made a ladder of prayer above the running water. The monastery that later came to be known as St. George of Choziba began as a cluster of such cells. It grew into a hanging compound that seems to defy gravity. Paths that cling to the cliff allow a human chain to carry bread and oil up to the refectory and to lower the dead gently down to the stream when it is time to bury them in cool earth. The whole complex is a meditation on the boundary between water and rock, between voice and silence. To stand on one of its balconies and look out across the wadi is to understand how a landscape can turn labor into devotion. Another focus of Christian memory rises above the oasis on the limestone ridge to the northwest. A tradition identified that height with the place where Jesus fasted and faced temptations, The Greek name for the summit, recorded in later centuries, is a title that fits the view. The ridge feels like a lookout over the world. A monastery clings there as well, built in phases over many centuries. The rooms seem to grow from the cliff itself, steps cut in the rock edge toward chapels where candles mark the stone with smoke. The effect, again, is of a garden city turned inward. Where Herod used water to stage pleasure and power, monks used space and silence to stage renunciation. Both projects required an engineer's mind and a community that kept rules. Roman power became Byzantine power when the empire turned east in its political center and in its faith. Administrative names changed, and new churches rose alongside the synagogues that continued to serve their communities. The oasis kept feeding both. The palace complexes drifted into partial ruin and were cannibalized for stone when new public buildings were needed. Some sections continued as official residences for governors who preferred winter among palms to winter in the hill city. Taxes still moved through in grain and in dried dates, and in cash that paid soldiers and repaired bridges after storms. Inscriptions from the period record donors to churches and donors to synagogues, a mundane but precious proof that daily religious life can sit side by side without the drama that later polemics sometimes demand. The road to Jerusalem was still the artery that made and broke seasons. Passover in the hill city could draw tens of thousands of people in earlier centuries. Pilgrimage feasts in the Christian era also swelled the road. Jericho benefited as the first and last place to rest and buy water. That also made the oasis vulnerable when politics turned violent. During the 1st century revolt against Rome, Roman forces swept the valley and took Jericho as part of their strategy to isolate Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus gives a bleak account of fighting and flight in the area. The details are colored by rhetoric and by his own complicated position, but the outline of disruption is clear. When war comes to a place like this, the damage is read like a ledger of broken irrigation, trampled gardens, and burned storehouses, rather than like toppled city walls. Water and groves can recover, but people consider carefully where they want to rebuild after they see soldiers at their gate. Earthquakes that shake the Jordan Valley from time to time added their own punctuation. A strong quake in the early 4th century damaged buildings across the region, and another, in the late 4th, destroyed many churches and synagogues that had only recently been built. Jericho did not escape such blows. You can trace the pattern in layers of rebuild and in the way mosaics shift and crack beneath new floors. A late antique mosaic often lies like a page under a later one, both beautiful, both still legible in parts, the work of separate generations that shared the same room and the same address without ever meeting. Natural forces and human purposes wrote alternate chapters in the same house. For all these shocks, the late Roman and Byzantine centuries at Jericho feel like a long afternoon of continuous care. Aqueducts needed yearly attention. Pools needed frequent replastering. Groves demanded pruning on a strict schedule and replacement when a palm aged. Men and women who worked as gardeners, stonemasons, plasterers, cooks, and gatekeepers passed skills from neighbor to neighbor. A visitor could arrive in the morning in the dry wind from the desert, and by noon feel the air drop to something soft near a shady court where water talked in the channels. Courts of bishops and of local rulers met in cooler rooms that faced the pools. Paperwork was done with a view into gardens. Jericho taught power to dress calmly. Strangers from far lands left records of what they saw. The Bordeaux pilgrim in the 4th century took the road down from Jerusalem and ticked off holy places with the brevity of someone writing a list for a friend. Later, travelers were more expansive. They wrote about the palms and the Jordan, about monasteries that clung to cliffs, about hospices where they met monks who served bread and olives and told them where to walk next. These texts sound modern in their specificity. You can trace their footsteps today by the same light on the same rocks. Even where a building has shifted or a name has migrated, the pattern of approach has a memory that is hard to erase. One more institution deserves mention because it has outlasted every army that climbed this road. Hospitality in Jericho became a craft. Caravanseries and pilgrim houses lined the approaches to the main spring. Some were simple courtyards with rooms on 3 sides and a gate that could be barred at dusk. Others were elaborate inns attached to a monastery or a synagogue, where the duties of welcome were a matter of rule as well as a matter of business. People who kept these houses learned the needs of whole seasons. They stored barley for animals. They bought bales of reeds to repair sleeping mats. They kept lamps and oil in bulk. They knew when a road was safe and when it was not. Their quiet knowledge was how an empire felt in a single room. That empire shifted again when the Sasanian armies pushed into the Levant in the early 7th century. In the year that Christians remember for the loss of holy places and for wounds to monasteries and churches, Jericho and its valley felt the arrival of new masters and the departure of old patrons. The Persian occupation was not long by the measure of the oasis. It did damage that monks and villagers had to repair after Byzantine control briefly returned. The exhaustion of that conflict had only just set in when another power arrived from the south and east, speaking the language of the desert and carrying a new set of promises about community and law. The late antique profile of Jericho at that moment is a palimpsest. The palaces begun in Hasmonean times and made grand by Herod still sent up walls where swallows nested. The aqueducts still crossed the wadis on low arches. The synagogues held their mosaic floors like rugs, rolled out for guests who paused from errands to sit and talk. The monasteries held to the cliffs where the sound of the stream is loudest after rain. Pilgrim inns kept bread ready for strangers. The garden was still a machine for water and shade and sweetness. The faiths that walked its lanes did not cancel one another. They shared the same air and left words in Greek and Aramaic and Latin on stones now kept in museums. The place had become an archive of devotion. Stand at the spring today and listen hard, and you can still hear that overlapping story. A bell from a monastery up the wadi. The call of a muezzin from the modern town beyond the groves. A bus braking on the road up to the ridge. A guide telling a small group that this is where a tax collector climbed a tree to see better. Someone reading a dedication off a mosaic to a friend who wanted proof that the menorah was really there in stone. The voices are different. The setting is the same. Empires pass. Faiths settle in. Water keeps moving. Stand beside the spring at es-Sultan, and the past begins to pile up in front of you like books left open in a wind. A traveler today can drink from the same reliable source that called Natufian foragers to linger and drew early farmers to build floors of white plaster. Yet the story of Jericho after late antiquity is not only a retelling of old beginnings. It is a record of how a place keeps reinventing itself through many regimes. How memory and science sometimes argue and sometimes agree, and how the quiet insistence of water keeps cities alive even when walls fall and palaces fade. After the armies of the early 7th century marched through the Levant, Jericho learned new names and new rhythms. Under the first centuries of Islamic rule, the oasis appeared in Arabic geographies as Ariha, praised for bananas and dates, for balsam shrubs that yielded a valued perfume, and for sweet water that tasted as if it had been filtered through gardens. Administrators counted groves and canals along with households. Courts in Damascus and then in Jerusalem and Ramla understood that Jericho was more than a pretty wintering ground. It was an agricultural engine that ran on careful hydrology. The Umayyad age left one of the clearest signatures of that confidence just north of the spring, at a site called Khirbat al-Mafjar. There, in the 8th century, a princely residence rose on a square plan with a monumental gateway, halls dressed in carved stucco, and a bathhouse whose floors were covered in complex mosaics. The most famous panel shows a tree flanked by 2 deer and a hunting beast, a scene that turns the geometry of a garden into a parable about order and danger. Whether the complex was begun for the Caliph Hisham or for his nephew Walid, it makes one point beyond doubt. The rulers of this period used architecture to say that the desert edge could be tamed and made delightful. That confidence did not immunize the oasis against shocks. Earthquakes have always belonged to the Jordan Valley. One strong event in the middle of the 8th century wrecked buildings from Galilee to the lower valley. The palace at Khirbat al-Mafjar shows a rupture in its story around that time, with walls fallen and rooms left unfinished or abandoned. War also returned again and again. Crusader and Ayyubid and Mamluk campaigns left their signatures in taxes and in damage. Yet even at moments when palaces sagged and monasteries withdrew behind repaired doors, Jericho's green belt endured. Sugar mills ran along the wadis in the late medieval centuries. Cane fields and aqueducts made a second industry to stand alongside dates and citrus. Millstones and flumes still lie in the ravines where winter water descends from the Judean hills. Each is a reminder that empires rise and fall, while people at the oasis go on making sweetness from water. And Sunday. Ottoman registers in the early modern period picture Jericho as a small place among palms and fields. Travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries wrote with a mixture of disappointment and wonder. They found ruins and groves and a village whose houses clung to the watercourses. They also found that the old road to Jerusalem still demanded a stop here for fodder and rest before the climb. The 19th century sharpened that picture and gave it maps. European and American explorers arrived with notebooks, compasses, and an appetite for correlating texts with terrain. Edward Robinson identified places by listening to Arabic names that had preserved old sounds. The survey of Western Palestine under Claude Conder and Horatio Kitchener sketched the wadis, the springs, and the sites with military precision. The Palestine Exploration Fund published careful plates of tells and monasteries. In these pages, Jericho moves from legend to coordinate points. The spring is fixed by elevation. The tell is labeled with its Arabic and English names. The mosaic of memory begins to be grouted with measurement. Archaeology then stepped from the page into the ground. In the early 20th century, Ernst Sellin and Karl Watzinger opened trenches at the tell and at nearby sites. They worked in a period when excavation methods still mixed curiosity with rough handling. Even so, they helped set questions that would organize debate for decades. What did the earliest walls look like? When did the Bronze Age city rise, and when did it burn? How many times did people reshape the ramparts? A generation later, John Garstang returned with improved field practice and a determination to find the city of Joshua. His trenches exposed a massive burn layer, and he read the pottery to place the destruction around 14 centuries before the Common Era. The story seemed to lock into place. A walled city had burned, and the date looked right. Then came Kathleen Kenyon with a new grammar for digging. Beginning in the 1950s, she cut through the mound in deep, narrow sections, controlling the stratigraphy layer by layer rather than emptying broad areas in large bites. Her method slowed the work and multiplied the notebooks, but it produced a sequence you could trust. In Jericho, it produced a surprise. The great fortified city that Garstang tied to Joshua she placed earlier by more than a century. The destruction belonged to the end of the Middle Bronze Age, a time when several Canaanite towns suffered similar fates as regional politics shifted and Egyptian power pressed north. Later, radiocarbon dates drawn from charred grain inside the burn layer backed her reading. Even scholars who disagreed with parts of Kenyon's interpretation had to answer her method. Jericho became a classroom where archaeology learned to argue with evidence rather than with wishes. While the debate about Bronze Age dates drew the headlines, other teams turned the valley into a coherent archive. Ehud Netzer traced ribbons of palace ground at Tulul Abu el Alayek along Wadi Kelt and mapped Hasmonean and Herodian pleasure complexes down to their aqueduct inlets and bath drains. His reconstructions showed a court city tuned to water, a place where pools and channels were not decoration but infrastructure for power. The rooms where guests reclined in winter sun, the porticos where courtiers moved from audience to bath, the open courts where figs dried and date clusters were stacked in the shade, all spoke of a political language that used gardens as both theatre and treasury. Farther north and west, conservators returned again and again to Khirbat al-Mafjar to free stuccos from salt and to sweep sand off mosaics, a quiet labor that feels like a vow to keep memory legible. Modern Jericho also learned the hard grammar of the 20th century. Under the British Mandate, the town grew along new roads, and hotels took shape to service the motor age of pilgrimage. The Jericho-Jordan cable car that now carries visitors to the monastery on the cliff is an heir to that impulse to move people through view and story. Earthquakes did not spare the valley in this century either. In 1927, a strong event shook the Jordan corridor and toppled buildings from Jerusalem to the Gore. Jericho felt it in cracked walls and damaged aqueducts. Repairs followed because gardens and groves do not wait. Water timers had to be reset. Channels had to be plastered again. The logic of the oasis pulled people back to the practical. Wars rearranged borders and daily lives. In 1948, local notables met in Jericho to try to decide the fate of the valleys and ridges west of the river. In 1967, new lines were drawn all over the map of the region. In the 1990s, the first steps of a political agreement returned day-to-day administration of Jericho and its surrounding area to a newly formed Palestinian Authority. That handover was not a footnote. It made the city an early stage where new institutions learned how to govern archaeological sites and tourist economies while also managing schools, water, and roads. Conservation projects at the Tell and at the Umayyad Palace accelerated under that local stewardship, sometimes with foreign technical help, sometimes under the hands of stonemasons and mosaic workers trained in workshops in the town itself. The Tell kept teaching. Work by an Italian-Palestinian expedition resumed in the late 1990s and into the 21st century, reopening trenches with careful tools and new questions. Research teams brought to Jericho methods that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. Micromorphology slices of floor plaster revealed how rooms were used and cleaned. Portable X-ray fluorescence mapped the chemistry of pigments on stuccos and wall plasters. Ground-penetrating radar traced buried walls before a single spade went in. Drone surveys stitched hundreds of images into precise three-dimensional models that let scholars measure courses of brick at a desk far from the valley. None of this technology changes the core truth that a trowel in a steady hand is what finally reveals a flaw or a jar rim. It does change what can be predicted and protected before the ground is disturbed. The wider public learned a new way to see Jericho as well. Conservation guidelines stopped being a purely academic matter. They became signs at site entrances, shaded platforms for visitors to stand on, and interpretive panels that talk about plaster recipes and canal gradients as if they were characters in the plot. The most impressive step came when the mound itself was recognized by the world in formal terms. The ancient core of the site was inscribed on a list that exists to single out places where the past speaks with uncommon clarity about the human story. The language of that recognition emphasized that at es-Sultan you can see the earliest steps into village life, the rise of urban fortifications born from local soils and climate, and a continuity of settlement that ties together eras normally kept in separate textbooks. It was a bureaucratic act with a ceremonial feel, a seal on a long conversation between the spring and the people who have tended it. Every recognition brings responsibilities. The mound erodes if paths are poorly chosen or if winter storms cut new gullies. The palace stuccos at Kiabat al-Mafjar powder and flake when salts wick up into them from damp soils. The mosaic floors that have survived for more than 1,000 years darken under wind-blown dust and lighten under harsh cleaning. The answer to all of these problems is mundane and noble at once. It is training, funding, and pride. Local conservators now work side by side with foreign specialists. School groups visit the sites and hear that the faces on the plastered skulls are not trophies, but family portraits from a time when memory had to be modeled in lime. Guides learn to tell the difference between Middle Bronze jars and Roman amphorae, so that a visitor leaves knowing why the shapes matter. The oasis as a whole becomes a classroom where science and story finally share the same breath. The modern town has learned to balance that role with ordinary life. Its markets sell oranges, dates, and herbs grown within a bicycle ride of the Tell. The road to the river and the bridge east is brisk, with buses and trucks that carry flour and people and plans. Monks ring bells above the wadi. Calls to prayer bounce off the cliff below the monastery. On festival days, pilgrims walk with purpose between the spring and the river. On quiet mornings, elderly men sit under palms and play backgammon in the same shade where Hasmonean overseers once counted amphorae. The continuity is not sentimental, it is practical. A good place dictates certain behaviors if you wish to live well there. In this long modern chapter, a few images stand out. Conservators unrolling protective textiles over a newly cleaned mosaic so that a dust storm will not undo their work in a single night. A surveyor waking before dawn to set targets in the ruins of Herod's winter palace so that the heat shimmer at noon will not corrupt the measurements. A local school class crowding the edge of a trench on the Tell to watch an archaeologist lift a bag of charred barley from a floor where a roof once fell on a basket. The moment the teacher speaks softly and tells the students that these seeds were people's food, that they smell faintly sweet even after 3,000 years, and that this is how we know the season of a city's last day. Science becomes personal in such moments, and the oasis gains one more set of guardians. The last lesson of Jericho's modern story is perhaps the simplest. A spring can anchor a human community across changes that would wreck a lesser place. Water falls through limestone high above the valley, gathers in faults, and emerges here as a steady gift. People who drink from it learn to make shallow channels and to keep them clean. They learn to plant where wind breaks and to build where floods cannot easily reach. They learn to remake public life as needed while keeping the private craft of living at the oasis intact. Over very long time, this becomes a kind of civic character. It is why a Neolithic tower, a Canaanite glacis, a Herodian pool, an Umayyad bath, a monastic cell, and a modern visitor center can all feel like pages of the same book rather than chapters from different volumes. Walk once more from the tell toward the spring late in the day. The light falls along the rough stone faces of the oldest works. The palm fronds make their slow click in the breeze. The water runs in channels that have never stopped needing attention. In that sound is the entire argument of Jericho. The first city in the world may not be a title that anyone can award without debate. What this place can claim without any argument is something better. It is a demonstration across 10,000 years that human beings and a landscape can learn each other so well that they become a single story.